They thought she was dead, until she walked into the ballroom with New York's most dangerous man's hand around her waist. 3 years ago, Selena Vaughn left the Sterling Crown Hotel in a torrential downpour, penniless, alone, her crumpled white dress and the humiliation clinging to her every step. Her husband stood in the ballroom with his mistress, a smile on his face. The divorce papers had been signed before the anniversary celebration began. Today, she's back, and all of New York is about to realize they were wrong to think breaking a woman was enough to kill her. If you want to know what happens next, hit like, leave a comment with the city you're viewing, and follow this story to the end. I want to know how far my story has come. The rain hadn't let up since morning. It hit the sidewalk in hard, flat sheets, the kind that didn't just soak you but punished you. Drove cold through your jacket, through your skin, straight into your bones. Selena Vaughn stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her 43rd floor apartment and watched the storm work over Manhattan like it had a personal grudge. She held her coffee with both hands, not because she was cold, but because she needed something solid to grip, something that wouldn't move unless she decided it would. She hadn't slept, not properly, not the way she used to sleep before everything, that deep, uncomplicated darkness that used to come easy when she believed life was going the way it was supposed to. Sleep like that didn't visit her anymore. These days, when she closed her eyes, what came back was always the same. The ballroom, the laughter. The way Damien's hand had rested on Vanessa Hale's lower back, while Selena stood 5 feet away with champagne going warm in her glass, and a smile nailed so hard across her face it left marks she could still feel in the morning. That had been 3 years ago. She still couldn't explain why memory worked that way. The important things went soft and blurry over time. But humiliation? Humiliation stayed sharp. Humiliation had a way of preserving itself perfectly, like something kept in formaldehyde. Every detail, the pattern on the tablecloth, the exact pitch of Vanessa's laugh, the way the chandeliers had scattered light across the marble floor so that even the shadows looked expensive. Selena turned away from the window. The apartment was different now. She'd sold the old one, the one Damien had picked, in the building Damien had chosen, 2 floors below the couple Damien wanted to impress. This place was hers. No decorator, no compromises. Stark lines, dark wood, shelves full of financial documents and legal briefs stacked beside first edition novels she actually read. Not for show. Not for the benefit of guests who might judge whether her taste matched her money. The coffee was going cold. She drank it anyway. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She already knew who it was before she looked. The gala is confirmed for Friday. Moretti's people called again. He wants to know your answer. Selena set the cup down and read the message twice. Not because she hadn't understood it the first time, because she wanted to feel what the words did to her chest, whether it was fear or excitement or something else entirely that she hadn't found a name for yet. She typed back, "Tell him yes." Then she set the phone face down and stood very still for a moment, listening to the rain. The first time she'd met Lucien Moretti, she'd been in the back of a car that wasn't hers, eating a sandwich that had gone stale 3 hours ago, wearing a blazer with a coffee stain near the left lapel that she'd tried to cover with her arm. This was 14 months after the divorce. 14 months of grinding work and borrowed time and eating lunch at her desk and learning, slowly and painfully, that the business world she'd spent a decade building a reputation in had a way of closing ranks when the right man told it to. Damien hadn't just taken her position at Cross Capital. He'd made phone calls, quiet ones, the kind where nothing explicit was said, but the meaning arrived perfectly intact. She's unstable, difficult, not worth the risk. 4 interviews in 6 weeks, 4 polite rejections. One senior partner at a wealth management firm had looked at her resume, actually good, genuinely impressive, and then looked at her and said, with the kind of practiced sympathy that was worse than no sympathy at all, "We've heard some concerns from industry contacts." She'd walked out of that office, stood on the sidewalk in the October cold, and understood for the first time in her life exactly what it meant to have nothing left to lose. Which was, she would come to understand, the most dangerous state a person could be in. The meeting with Moretti had happened through a contact she'd kept from before her marriage, a woman named Petra Halse, who ran a private equity consulting group out of a brownstone in the West Village, who had 3 phones and trusted exactly nobody, and who had called Selena 6 months after the divorce with the simple statement, There are people who would like to speak with you. Selena had asked which people. Petra had said, the kind who don't ask twice. The car had picked her up outside her temporary sublet in Hell's Kitchen, a neighborhood she'd once considered beneath her, which now struck her as exactly the kind of arrogance that had made her so easy to destroy. The apartment had been 2 rooms, 1 window, a radiator that clicked and hissed all night, and it had cost her more than she could reasonably afford. She'd loved it with a ferocity that surprised her. Something about earning a space with your own damage made it feel more real than anything purchased on a joint credit card. Moretti had been waiting in a private room above a restaurant in Tribeca. Not a flashy place, no one watching the door. Just dark wood and low light and the smell of something cooking with herbs she couldn't identify. He'd been seated at the end of a long table, jacket on, no tie, reading something on a tablet that he set aside when she entered. He was younger than she'd expected. Dark hair, angular features, the kind of stillness that made you suddenly aware of how much unnecessary movement most people carried in their bodies. He hadn't stood, hadn't offered his hand. He'd simply looked at her and said, "Sit down, Mrs. Vaughn." "It's Ms.," she'd said. "Vaughn." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to one, like he'd asked a question she hadn't known she was answering. "Ms. Vaughn," he'd said, "tell me what you know about Damien Cross." She'd sat down. She'd told him. Not everything, not then, not that night, but enough. Enough to feel the shape of what was happening in that room. Moretti had listened without interrupting, without note-taking, without any of the performance of listening that most powerful men put on to signal their own importance. He'd just been still and present, and when she finished, he'd looked at her for a long moment and said, "What do you want?" Not what happened to you. He already knew the broad strokes. Not how can I help. That would have been condescending, and she suspected he knew that too. Just, what do you want? She hadn't answered immediately. She'd looked at the table, at her own hands, and said something she hadn't planned to say. "I want to still be standing when he hits the floor." Moretti had nodded slowly. "That," he'd said, "I can work with." Well, 14 months. That was how long it had taken. People who thought wealth and power moved quickly had never watched someone systematically dismantle another person's empire from the inside out. This wasn't a heist. It wasn't theatrical. It was patient, surgical work, the kind that required intelligence and the particular cold-blooded endurance of someone who could play the long game without letting the need for resolution eat them alive. Selena had brought the intelligence. Moretti had brought everything else. She'd spent 6 of those 14 months embedded so deeply in the financial forensics of Cross Capital that she dreamed in spreadsheets, following threads through offshore subsidiaries and shell companies and LLC layers stacked like Matryoshka dolls, each one holding something dirtier than the last. Damien Cross had not been merely corrupt. He had been architecturally corrupt, the way someone is when they've been doing it so long it stopped feeling like anything at all, like breathing. Like something that just happened naturally because everything in their environment had arranged itself to accommodate it. She'd built the case in pieces, working with Moretti's lawyers, with forensic accountants who asked no unnecessary questions, with 2 former federal investigators who were now, shall we say, working in the private sector. Every document had to be clean, every chain of custody had to hold. Because Damien had lawyers who had made careers out of punching holes in exactly this kind of case, and Selena had not come this far to watch it unravel on a technicality. She'd had bad nights. Plenty of them. Nights where she sat at her desk at 2 a.m. staring at documents until the numbers blurred and thought, what if this doesn't work? What if none of this works and I've spent 2 years building something that just collapses and he wins and I'm 40 years old and starting over again with nothing? She'd never said that out loud, not once. Partly out of pride, partly because she'd learned from watching, from surviving, that fear expressed at the wrong moment to the wrong person had a way of being used against you. You kept your doubts internal, you metabolized them into fuel, and you got back to work. But she'd felt them. Every single one. 3 days before the Black Orchid Gala, Selena sat across a long conference table from Lucien Moretti and 4 of his lawyers. The documents were laid out between them, hundreds of pages, organized into color-coded portfolios that represented years of financial crimes, 3 distinct federal violations, and enough material to bury Damien Cross under a sentence that would make his entire legacy smell like rot for the next generation. "It's ready," said the lead attorney, a woman named Claire Soren, who wore her gray hair cropped close and looked like she'd been built from the bones of arguments she'd already won. "We hand this to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We get an emergency warrant, and the raid happens within 72 hours. Selena looked at the portfolio in front of her. She didn't open it. She already knew every page. "Before or after the gala?" she asked. Claire glanced at Moretti. Moretti looked at Selena. "Your call," he said. She thought about it. Not for long. After. Let him have Friday night. Let him stand there with his fiancée and his new suits and all those people who chose him over me. Let him feel safe. She paused. Then take it. Moretti said nothing. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention he had. The kind that didn't rush and didn't flatter and didn't try to soften anything. Like he was simply witnessing her exactly as she was and finding nothing that needed to be adjusted. It made her uncomfortable sometimes. She wasn't used to being looked at without an agenda behind the eyes. "The gala itself," Claire said, moving on. "We've reviewed the security arrangement." "I'll handle my security," Moretti said, with a finality that ended the sentence. Claire closed her portfolio. After the lawyers left, Selena and Moretti sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. This happened occasionally, not often. Their relationship was not the kind that had been built on comfort or familiarity. It had been built on precision, on mutual understanding of what was at stake, on a shared unspoken recognition that they were both people who had learned early that the world rewarded ruthlessness and punished sentiment, and had each made their peace with that lesson in different ways. Still, something had shifted in the last few months. She couldn't have said exactly when it started. Maybe the night she'd come to his office at midnight to tell him about a document she'd found, a wire transfer that tied Damien directly to the fraudulent contract she'd been chasing for weeks. And Moretti had looked up from his desk, and there had been something in his face that wasn't calculation. It was brief, and he'd recovered immediately, and they'd spent the next 2 hours going over the document in total professional focus. But she'd seen it. She wasn't sure what to do with it. "You're not nervous," he said now. Not a question. "I'm always nervous," she said. "I've just gotten good at not showing it." "There's a difference between nervous and afraid." He leaned back in his chair slightly. "Are you afraid?" She considered lying, discarded it. "Of seeing him? No. Of who I've become? Sometimes." Moretti didn't offer reassurance. She would have been annoyed if he had. Instead, he said, "Becoming someone who survives is never pretty. That's not a design flaw." She looked at him for a moment. "That the most philosophical you get?" Something moved in his eyes. Not quite humor, but something adjacent. "Get some sleep, Ms. Vaughn. Friday is going to be a long night." But she hadn't gotten enough sleep. Friday arrived with cold, clear air and a sky the particular shade of blue that New York sometimes produced in late autumn. Bright, almost hostile in its clarity, like a spotlight with no warmth behind it. Selena spent the morning reviewing the last of the files, spent the afternoon with her assistant, finalizing the conversations she intended to have at the gala. Who to approach, in what order, how to let information fall into the right conversations at the right moments, without it looking like she was doing anything at all. Strategic, surgical, no raised voices, no visible anger. Her dress had been hanging in the closet for 2 weeks. Black satin. Simple, severe, deliberately not trying to be anything other than what it was. The jeweler who'd brought the diamonds to her apartment had asked if she wanted something softer, perhaps a necklace with more feminine warmth. She'd looked at him over the rim of her reading glasses and said, "Diamonds aren't warm, that's the point." She was standing in front of the mirror, fully dressed, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She picked up anyway. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, "You think you're very clever." Damien's voice. She hadn't heard it in over a year. It landed in her stomach like a stone dropped in cold water, the ripple spreading outward before she could stop it. She kept her voice even. "How did you get this number?" "Doesn't matter." He sounded different, tighter, like a man who'd been running for a long time and could feel the thing behind him getting closer. "I know what you've been doing, Selena. I know about Moretti. I know about the documents." "Okay," she said. "Okay?" His voice went up a notch. That's all you've got? Okay. What would you like me to say, Damien? I want you to stop. A beat. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Something underneath the aggression, something that almost sounded like it had once been human. We were good together, before everything. You know that. You know we were good. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, opened them. The woman in the mirror looked back at her, calm, diamonds resting against her throat like they'd always been there. No, Selena said. You were good at making me believe we were good. That's not the same thing. She hung up. Her hands weren't shaking. She noticed that. Checked it deliberately, the way you check a healing wound to see how far it's come. A year ago, that call would have undone something in her, would have sent her back to that night in the rain, that moment standing outside the hotel with her marriage dissolving in real time around her. Now it just made her reach for her clutch and check that everything was in order. Her phone buzzed. Moretti's driver. Ready when you are. But the convoy assembled in front of her building like something from a different world. 4 black armored SUVs, engines running, men in tailored suits moving with the unhurried precision of people who did this every day because they did this every day. Moretti was waiting by the lead vehicle. He looked at her once, just a quick assessment, and she could not have told you precisely what he saw in her face, but whatever it was, it satisfied something in him. He didn't say she looked beautiful the way men said things like that to fill space. He said, Ready? Almost my words. Yes. He held the door. She got in. They rode to the gala in near silence, the city moving past the tinted windows in smears of light and motion. At some point, somewhere on Fifth Avenue, Moretti said quietly, If anything feels off tonight, you step back. My people will know. I know you can handle it. I said step back. There's a difference. He looked at her. I didn't spend 14 months on this to watch it fall apart because you decided to handle it alone at the wrong moment. She looked out the window. Fine, she said. The Sterling Crown came into view, the same hotel. Of course it was the same hotel. Damien had a weakness for symbolism, the way certain men had a weakness for alcohol. The same marble steps, the same golden light spilling from the entrance, the cameras outside, the crowd. Selena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 years ago, she had walked out of this building with nothing. Tonight, she was arriving. The SUV stopped. The door opened. Men in black suits fanned out first, scanning, standing. Moretti stepped out and then turned back, extending his hand, not performatively, just practically, the way you offered your hand to someone stepping onto uneven ground. She took it. They walked toward the entrance together, and she could already feel it. The shift in the air, the way people near the door stopped mid-sentence and turned, the way attention moved like a current. She didn't look at any of them. She kept her eyes forward, her chin level, her spine straight. She had imagined this moment many times, had rehearsed her face for it, practiced the specific quality of indifference she wanted to wear like a second gown. What she hadn't prepared for was the sound that rose from inside the ballroom as they entered. Not gasps exactly, but something close. That collective intake of breath that a room makes when it sees something it didn't predict and doesn't yet understand. Then she saw him, Damien Cross, standing 40 feet away with Vanessa Hale on his arm, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her first apartment. He looked well. He looked successful. He looked like a man who had taken everything he'd wanted and was currently enjoying the taste of it. He looked at her, and every single carefully rehearsed expression Selena had prepared dissolved, because she realized, standing there in that room in front of all those people, that she didn't need any of them. She just looked back at him, calm, still, untouchable. The color left his face slowly, like water draining from a glass. And in the moment before the whole room started moving and whispering and the night began to unfold into everything they'd planned, Selena understood something she hadn't fully understood until that exact second. She hadn't come here for revenge. She'd come here to show him, to show all of them, that you could take everything from a person and they could still stand in front of you like a monument to everything you'd failed to destroy. Damien Cross took one step toward her, his expression shifting into that familiar mask of managed confidence. But Selena had already turned away, because she'd already seen everything she needed to see in his face, He was afraid. And the night, she knew now with absolute certainty, was only beginning. Lucien Moretti placed his hand against the small of her back, steady, unhurried, carrying the full weight of a man who feared nothing in this room, and leaned slightly toward her. "There's someone you need to speak to," he said quietly. "Third table on the left. Damien's largest investor. He's been nervous for 6 weeks. Tonight, he's going to want to hear what you have to say." She nodded. They moved forward into the glittering, dangerous crowd, and somewhere behind them, Selena heard Damien's voice saying her name, that old, familiar attempt to reclaim something that had already stopped belonging to him. She didn't turn around. She would speak to the investor. She would speak to 3 more after him. And each conversation would be another stone pulled from the foundation of everything Damien Cross believed was still standing beneath his feet. He just didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out that the woman he'd thrown away in the rain 3 years ago had spent every single day since then making sure that when she finally came back, she wouldn't just come back. She'd come back as something he had no defense against. The question was, what would she do when she realized that somewhere between the planning and the precision and the quiet, dangerous work of the last 14 months, she had begun to feel something she absolutely had not planned for. Something that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the man standing beside her. The investor's name was Gerald Fitch, 61 years old, third-generation money, the kind of man who wore his wealth the way old buildings wore their age, quietly, structurally, as if it had always been there and always would be. He was standing near the bar with a glass of scotch, and the particular expression of someone who had been trying to look comfortable for about 45 minutes and wasn't getting better at it. Selena had studied his file for 3 weeks. She knew his portfolio, his risk tolerance, his 2 divorces, his daughter at Columbia, and the fact that he'd invested $60 million into Cross Capital's expansion fund 18 months ago, 6 months after the first irregularities had started appearing in the books. Gerald Fitch didn't know what he'd invested in. That was the only reason she was going to be kind about this. She approached him alone. Moretti had peeled away smoothly. No fanfare, no instruction, just a slight adjustment in direction, and suddenly he was elsewhere, absorbed into a conversation near the far windows, as if he'd always been heading there. She'd noticed he did that. The way he moved through rooms, through situations, through the social machinery of powerful gatherings. It was like watching someone who had learned very early that the most dangerous presence was the one people forgot to watch. "Gerald." She extended her hand, smiled, but not too much. Not the bright performance smile she'd spent years perfecting as Damien Cross's wife. Just enough. Warm and precise and entirely controlled. Fitch shook her hand and she could feel the hesitation in his grip, that split-second pause of a man recalibrating in real time, running through what he knew about her, deciding what version of Selena Vaughn he was dealing with tonight. "Selena." He recovered quickly. Give him credit for that. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Neither did most people," she said. "How are you, Gerald? How's Maya?" His daughter's name. She watched it register. A flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed. "She's good. 2nd year. Thank you for asking." He sipped his scotch. "You look well." "I am well." She let that sit for a beat. Let him feel the weight of what well meant in this context. "I've been spending a lot of time on financial forensics lately. Did you know that Cross Capital restructured their offshore holdings in the Caymans 3 times in the last 14 months? Fitch went very still. She kept her voice light, conversational, like she was discussing the weather pattern over the Hudson. "I ask because the timing is interesting. The restructuring happened at very specific intervals, right before each quarterly audit cycle, almost like clockwork." She tilted her head slightly. "You're a smart man, Gerald. I'm sure you've noticed some things in your returns that didn't quite add up." He set his glass down on a passing tray, both hands free now. She noted that. "Selena, I'm not accusing you of anything," she said immediately. "I know exactly how Damien works. I was married to him for 7 years. He's very good at making people feel like partners until they're not." A pause. "I just thought you should know that there are people, federal people, who are very interested in the Cayman restructuring. And the investors who cooperate early tend to land very differently than the ones who don't." The color in Fitch's face had gone a shade closer to ash. "Are you threatening to me?" "No." She meant it. I'm the only person in this room warning you. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, long enough to let the information settle, not so long that it felt like a standoff, then touched his arm briefly and moved on. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. One down. Quote. The ballroom was arranged around a central floor, tables fanning outward in a horseshoe, the bar running along the east wall, and a string quartet working through something classical in the far corner that nobody was actually listening to. Selena moved through it the way she'd learned to move through rooms that wanted to consume her. With purpose and without urgency, which was harder than it sounded, because every instinct she had was tracking Damien's position in her peripheral vision like a compass needle pulled toward something it couldn't ignore. He was watching her. She knew it without looking directly, could feel it the way you feel a draft from a window you haven't located yet. She had 2 more conversations to engineer before the night reached its crisis point. The second was a woman named Iris Langford, who ran a charitable foundation that had, according to Selena's research, been used by Damien to launder a specific set of transactions through what appeared on paper to be legitimate philanthropic grants. Iris Langford did not know this. Or if she knew it, she'd managed to maintain a very convincing performance of not knowing it for a considerable amount of time. She found Iris near the entrance to the terrace, talking to a city councilwoman about something that appeared to involve a lot of enthusiastic nodding. Selena waited, watched the councilwoman move on, approached. Iris, your foundation's work in the South Bronx last year was remarkable. The youth literacy numbers were extraordinary. She'd done her research on the actual good work too, always. Because flattery built from nothing was detectable, but flattery built from truth hit differently. It said, I see you, I paid attention, I took you seriously. And people in this world were so starved of genuine attention that a single specific compliment could open a door that an hour of charm couldn't. Iris Langford looked genuinely pleased. You followed that initiative? Closely. Selena accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. Didn't drink it. I also followed your Q4 funding reports. They were filed very precisely. A beat. Almost too precisely, given the grant sources. Iris's smile didn't disappear. It just stopped moving. Froze in place, which was almost worse. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean that some of the institutional donors listed in your Q4 filings are holding companies that don't have a public profile consistent with the scale of their donations. It's the kind of thing that, in a routine audit, would raise questions. She kept her voice measured. I don't think you set this up, Iris. I think you were given paperwork and you trusted the people who gave it to you. The frozen smile finally faded. Underneath it was the face of a woman who had been living with a low-grade anxiety for a long time and was now experiencing the relief and terror of having it named. What are you suggesting I do? I'm suggesting you call your lawyer on Monday morning and ask them to review those Q4 filings before someone else does. Selena set her untouched champagne on the nearest table. Tell them a concerned colleague mentioned it at a social event. Keep it vague. Move quickly. She left Iris Langford standing by the terrace door looking like a woman who had just remembered she'd left the stove on at home. 2 down. She was crossing toward the third table, the one where Damien's last anchor investor, a quiet, brutal man named Paul Wesson, was holding court with 2 subordinates, when she heard Vanessa Hale's voice directly behind her. Selena. She stopped, turned. Vanessa Hale was, she had to acknowledge this, internally, where it didn't cost anything, a genuinely beautiful woman. Tall, polished, the kind of effortless presentation that actually required enormous effort and was designed to look like it didn't. She was wearing red tonight, which Selena had half expected. Vanessa had always been someone who needed to be the most visible person in any room. Her eyes were sharp, and her mouth was arranged in an expression that was technically a smile. You've been making the rounds, Vanessa said. It's a party, Selena said. That's what people do at parties. You've been talking to Damien's investors. I've been talking to people I know. She kept her voice neutral and slightly bored, which was the most offensive thing she could offer. Is there something I can help you with, Vanessa? Something moved in Vanessa's jaw. A tightening. Small, controlled, but there. You should be careful, Vanessa said. Playing games with men like Damien has consequences. I know, Selena said. I was married to him. And look how that ended. It was meant to land. Selena could feel the intent behind it, the specific weight of cruelty delivered with a smile. The technique of a woman who had been using other women's wounds as weapons for so long, it had become instinctive. 3 years ago, it would have landed. Tonight, Selena looked at Vanessa Hale with something that was almost pity. "You stole my husband," she said. "Not my dignity, and definitely not my leverage." She smiled, just slightly. "Enjoy your evening." She turned and walked away and did not allow herself to feel the shake in her knees until she was 8 full feet clear of that conversation. She had not planned for the shake in her knees. She filed that away. Dealt with it later. Paul Wesson was harder. He was a compact man, early 50s, the kind of physical economy that suggested either discipline or suppressed violence, and possibly both. He had the eyes of someone who had learned very early that most people could be bought, and the ones who couldn't were either saints or threats. And he had no patience for saints. He ran 3 private equity firms and had invested $42 million in Cross Capital over 4 years. Not because he trusted Damien Cross, Wesson didn't trust anyone on principle, but because the returns had been excellent and the documentation had been clean. When she approached his table, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he hasn't decided whether to dismiss or engage with. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "I heard you were back." "I never left," she said. "I was just quiet for a while." He didn't invite her to sit. She sat anyway. The 2 subordinates, reading the room, found sudden reasons to be somewhere else. "You've been talking to Fitch tonight," Wesson said, "and Langford." "I talked to a lot of people. Not casually." He turned his glass slowly on the tablecloth. "You came here with Moretti." "Yes." "That's an interesting choice of escort." "It's an interesting world," she said. He looked at her steadily. He was the kind of man who used silence as a pressure tool and knew exactly how long to hold it. She matched him. Let the silence run until it had run its natural course, and they were both simply 2 people looking at each other without performance. "What do you want from me?" he said finally. "Nothing. Tonight." She was honest about this because Wesson would detect any other approach immediately, and she'd lose him completely. "I want you to know what I know. What you do with it is your business." "And what do you know?" "I know that the Cayman accounts attached to the expansion fund were restructured to obscure the source of 3 specific tranches of capital that Damien used to cover losses in his secondary portfolio. Losses he hasn't disclosed to any of his investors." She let that settle. "I know the federal documentation supporting that is currently being reviewed by people at a level above both of us. And I know that Damien Cross is going to be standing in front of a very uncomfortable set of cameras within the next 30 days. Wesson's face had not changed, not visibly, but something behind his eyes had shifted, and she recognized it. The look of a man who had suspected something and was now hearing it confirmed and was currently doing rapid interior mathematics about damage control. "If this is accurate," he said, "why tell me? Why not just let the legal process—" "Because you didn't know," she said. "Same reason I talked to Fitch. You were used. That's not the same thing as being complicit." She stood. "And because the people who exit cleanly before the raid are in a different category than the people who are still standing in the building when it comes down." She walked away from his table, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her molars. She found a quiet alcove near the coat room behind a decorative column and stood there for 90 seconds with her back against the wall and her eyes closed and just breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 6. A technique she'd taught herself in the first year after the divorce, when panic attacks had come without warning in grocery stores and parking garages, and once, memorably, in the middle of a conference call with a potential client who'd never known anything was wrong. She could do this. She was doing this. She opened her eyes. Lucien Moretti was standing 6 feet away, watching her. "How long have you been standing there, Isas?" she asked. "Long enough." He moved closer, not crowding her, just closing the distance to something conversational. "Wesson?" "Done." "Fitch?" "Done." "Langford?" "Done." She exhaled. "The seeds are planted. Now we wait for—" "Damien's coming this way," Moretti said quietly. She looked up sharply. "Now?" 2 minutes, maybe less. He's been working up to it for 20 minutes. I've been watching him recalibrate after every conversation you had tonight. Something in his expression, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent, something that lived in the same general neighborhood. He's scared. Scared men make mistakes. Scared men also make scenes, she said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Do you want me to intercept? She thought about it. For a genuine moment, she thought about it. The relief of letting someone else hold that particular weight, of stepping back into the geometry of protection that Moretti had built around her over the last 14 months like a second skeleton. No, she said. He nodded once. I'll be close. He moved away and she stepped back out from behind the column and into the peripheral currents of the ballroom, and she had been standing at the edge of the dance floor for less than 40 seconds when she heard his footsteps behind her. That particular cadence, slightly too heavy for the shoes, something she would have recognized in the dark after 7 years. Selena, she turned. Damien Cross had looked better earlier in the evening from a distance. Up close, she could see things that distance had hidden. The tension in his jaw, the specific set of his shoulders that meant he was frightened and working very hard to cover it with aggression. His eyes had that quality she'd learned to read during the marriage, the brightness of a man running calculations while he spoke. Walk with me, he said. I'd rather not. I'm asking you to walk with me. His voice had dropped, and the social register had peeled back, and underneath it was something rawer and less managed. 5 minutes, Selena, please. The please stopped her, not because it softened her, because it was unexpected, and unexpected things required reassessment. She walked with him toward the terrace doors. The balcony overlooked the city, 40 floors of Manhattan spreading in every direction, the dark water of the Hudson visible as a break in the light to the west. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and clarifying. She'd left her wrap inside. She didn't go back for it. Damien closed the terrace door behind them, and they were alone. What did you say to Fitch? He asked. We caught up. Don't. His voice cracked slightly. Not emotion, but pressure. I know you've been working against me. I know what you've been doing. Petra Halls, the forensic accounts, the offshore documentation. I put it together weeks ago. Then you know I'm thorough, she said. I know you're making a mistake. He moved closer and she held her ground, which she'd learned cost nothing to do and communicated everything. Moretti is not what you think he is. He's using you. Whatever he told you, whatever arrangement you think you have, you don't get to warn me about men who use people, she said. You used me for 8 years. You built a company on my contacts, my strategy, my relationships, and then you threw me out of it when you got bored and replaced me with someone younger who wouldn't ask the right questions. Her voice didn't rise. That was the thing she was proud of. It didn't rise. You don't have the standing to warn me about anything. His expression fractured for a moment, just a crack in the managed surface, and she saw something underneath it that might once have made her feel something. The person he'd been before the company got big, and the money started distorting everything, and the man she'd married started becoming someone she barely recognized. She'd loved that earlier version. She had genuinely loved him. That person had apparently not been able to survive success. I can make this worse for you, he said. The crack sealed over. The management came back. I still have connections. I still have Damien. She said his name quietly, and something in the way she said it made him stop. I've already won. You just don't have the information yet to understand that. He stared at her. What does that mean? It means go back inside. Say goodbye to Vanessa tonight, and mean it. Because she's going to leave when the money does, and the money is leaving. She held his gaze. It means I'm sorry it ended like this. I'm sorry you made it end like this. And I'm done talking to you. She turned toward the terrace door. That was when he grabbed her wrist. Not gently. Not the reach of a man trying to reconnect. The grip of a man who had run out of options and was currently operating on adrenaline and desperation, which was the most dangerous combination in a person, because desperation had no brakes. Pain shot up her forearm, sharp, immediate. She didn't make a sound. She turned and looked at his hand on her wrist, and then looked at his face, and she was frightened. She registered that clearly. But underneath the fear was something colder and more structural, something that had been built in the basement of the last 3 years and was now apparently load-bearing. The terrace door opened. One of Moretti's men, she didn't know his name, didn't need to, materialized from the interior with the noiseless efficiency of someone who had been positioned specifically for this possibility. Then another. Then the door opened wider. And then Lucien Moretti stepped out. The cold air seemed to condense around him. He crossed the terrace without hurrying. 3 steps, 4, and stopped close enough to Damien that the geometry of it was unmistakable. He looked at Damien's hand on Selena's wrist, looked at Damien's face. He didn't raise his voice. "You touched my wife," he said. The words hit the air like a change in atmospheric pressure. Damien released her wrist, immediately, reflexively, the way you pull your hand back from something that just burned you. She stepped to the side and felt the circulation returning to her fingers and tried to control her breathing without being visible about it. "You can't threaten me," Damien said. His voice had gone to a register she recognized, the performative bravado of a man who knows he's losing and has decided the only remaining option is to bluff. "Not here, not in public." Moretti looked at him for a long moment. "That's true," he said, quietly, almost agreeably. And then he leaned forward slightly and said something else, lower, and Selena was close enough to hear it, and what she heard stopped the breath in her throat, not because it was loud, not because it was theatrical, but because it was said in the tone of a man simply stating a fact about the weather, with 0 performance and 0 hesitation. And she understood for the first time, fully, viscerally, in a way that all the research and all the planning and all the months of controlled strategy had not quite prepared her for exactly who she had been standing beside for the last 14 months. Damien Cross took a step back. His face had gone the specific white of a man who has just heard something that rearranges his entire understanding of his situation. Moretti turned away from him as if he no longer existed and looked at Selena, looked at her wrist. Something moved through his expression, brief and controlled and angry, in a way that had nothing theatrical about it. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, assessing whether that was true. Apparently decided it was. "Come inside," he said. She walked with him back through the terrace door and into the warmth of the ballroom, and behind her she heard Damien saying something, her name or something beginning with it. But the door closed and the sound of the city and the string quartet and 200 people talking swallowed it completely. She walked 6 steps into the ballroom and stopped. "What did you say to him?" she asked quietly. Moretti glanced at her. Nothing that wasn't true. Lucien. The use of his first name, she almost never used it. They had existed in a professional register for so long that it had its own grammar, its own unspoken rules, made him pause. He turned to face her fully. "I told him that if he touched you again," Moretti said, "there wouldn't be a federal case. There would just be a disappearance." He held her gaze. "And that I would consider the inconvenience worthwhile." She stared at him. "That's not something you say at a party," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's something you say when you mean it." The air between them held something she hadn't budgeted for tonight, something that had been building in the margins of the last 14 months. In the midnight meetings and the shared silences and the moments of honesty she'd allowed herself to have precisely because she'd been telling herself the whole time that they were professional, that they were strategic, that this was a transaction, and she knew exactly what it was. She opened her mouth. Her phone vibrated. Once, twice, then a 3rd time in rapid succession, the pattern she'd assigned to Claire Soren, her attorney. She looked at the screen. 3 messages. She read the first one and felt the blood drop from her face. "The warrant has been expedited. Someone moved the timeline up. The raid is happening tonight. Not Monday. Tonight. They're staging now." The second message. "Damien's legal team was tipped off 20 minutes ago. They're shredding documents remotely. We have maybe 45 minutes before the digital trail goes cold." The third message. "Selena. Someone inside leaked to them. Someone who knew the timeline. Someone who knew everything." She looked up from the phone. The ballroom was still moving around her, the champagne, the music, the 200 people who had no idea that the architecture of what had seemed like a social event was actually something else entirely, something that had been running on a completely different track all evening and was now derailing at speed. She looked at Moretti. "Someone leaked the timeline," she said. He had already read something in her face. His expression had gone very still. "Who knew?" she asked. "My lawyers. My team." A pause. Claire Soren. Claire's been with me for 2 years. Yes, he said. And your team? He didn't answer immediately, which was, itself, an answer. Lucien. Her voice was low, controlled, and underneath the control was something she hadn't felt in 14 months, something she'd thought she'd outgrown, thought she'd burned away in the long, cold work of the last 2 years. Who on your team knew the full timeline? He met her eyes, and what she saw there, not guilt, but the specific, careful stillness of a man managing information, sent a fracture straight through the center of everything she thought she understood about the last 14 months. There's something I need to tell you, he said. The string quartet finished their piece. For 3 full seconds, the ballroom was almost quiet. And in those 3 seconds, Selena Vaughn stood in the middle of everything she had built and everything she had trusted and understood, with a cold clarity that felt like standing at the edge of something with no visible bottom, that the question was no longer whether Damien Cross would fall. The question was whether the man she had chosen to stand beside had been the reason he almost didn't. There's something I need to tell you. Those 6 words. Selena had spent 2 years learning to read rooms, read documents, read the invisible architecture of power that held men like Damien Cross upright. She'd gotten good at it. Good enough to walk into a ballroom full of Manhattan's most dangerous people and dismantle a man's empire in 3 conversations without raising her voice. But she had not gotten good enough to read the man standing 18 inches in front of her. That was the thing that would stay with her longest, she thought. Not what he said next, but the 2 seconds before he said it, when she looked at Lucien Moretti's face and realized she had been looking at it for 14 months and had never once seen what was underneath. Tell me, she said. Not here. Tell me here. Around them, the ballroom continued its indifferent motion, glasses lifted, laughter rising and falling. The string quartet working through something new that sounded almost cheerful. 200 people wrapped in expensive fabric, completely unaware that 30 feet away the architecture of the night had just shifted on its foundation. Moretti glanced once at his nearest man, a slight tilt of his chin, some private signal language she'd never been given access to, and then looked back at her. There's a room upstairs, 44th floor. My team uses it for... I know the room, she said. She'd been in it twice during the planning phase. Private elevator access, reinforced door, a view of the city that felt like standing at the top of something that had no intention of catching you if you fell. Give me 3 minutes. She turned away from him before he could respond and walked, not quickly, not slowly, with the measured pace of a woman who was absolutely not coming apart at the structural level, toward the nearest restroom. She pushed through the door. One woman at the mirror, reapplying lipstick, who took one look at Selena's face and suddenly remembered she had somewhere else to be. The door swung shut. Selena stood at the sink and turned the cold water on and pressed both hands flat against the marble counter and looked at herself in the mirror and said, very quietly, to her own reflection, think. Not panic, not spiral. Think. The warrant had been expedited. Someone had moved the timeline. The tip to Damien's legal team had come 20 minutes ago, which meant it had come during the party, while she was here, while everyone who knew the full timeline was either in this building or reachable by phone from it. The document shredding had already started. 45 minutes, Claire had said, before the digital trail went cold. She had 42 minutes now. She turned off the water, dried her hands, looked at herself in the mirror one more time. The diamonds, the dress, the face she'd been constructing for 3 years, and said, later. Fall apart later. She walked out of the restroom and toward the private elevator. The room on the 44th floor was smaller than she remembered, or maybe it felt smaller because of what she was walking into it carrying. A rectangular table, 6 chairs, a window that ran the full width of the exterior wall, and the city below it doing what cities did at night, glittering without meaning, beautiful without caring whether anyone saw it. Moretti was already there, jacket still on, standing by the window, hands in his pockets. Not performing composure, actually composed, which was somehow worse. 2 of his men were positioned near the door. She looked at them. Outside, she said. Neither of them moved. They were looking at Moretti. Outside, Moretti said. They left. The door closed. The city hummed through the glass. Talk, Selena said. He turned from the window. In the lower light of this room, without the social performance of the ballroom below, he looked like what he actually was, a man who had made a career of living in the space between legal and not, and had the specific calm of someone who'd long since stopped pretending that space was comfortable. 3 weeks ago, he said, someone approached one of my lawyers. Not Claire, a different layer. Someone deep enough in the operation that his involvement would have been very difficult to trace. Approached how? With a proposal. He didn't flinch from her gaze. From Damien Cross's team. They'd identified a weak point in the legal chain. They offered, in exchange for the timeline and copies of the financial documentation, to make certain complications in my own portfolio disappear. The room was very quiet. Complications, she said. There are 2 federal inquiries into separate aspects of my business interests. Unrelated to your case, long-running, mostly nuisance level, but the kind of thing that becomes very loud at the wrong moment. He paused. They had access to the investigators. They offered to redirect those inquiries in exchange for the information. Selena stood completely still. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. That specific animal thudding that her body produced when it understood something a full beat before her mind caught up with it. Did you take it? She asked. No. Did your lawyer? A pause. 1 second. 2. He made contact, Moretti said. He didn't transfer anything, but he made contact, and that contact was intercepted by Damien's security team. And they've been working on the assumption for the last 10 days that the information was compromised. Was it? The timeline? No. The documentation? He looked at her steadily. Possibly. She turned away from him, walked to the window, stood with her back to him, and looked at the city and tried to process what she was holding. Not just the facts of it, but the specific texture of the betrayal, which was different from what she'd expected. She'd expected, on some level, a clean villain, someone who had chosen against her clearly and deliberately. What she had instead was messier and in some ways worse, a man who had kept the essential faith but whose organization had cracked somewhere she hadn't seen, and who had known about the crack for 10 days and had not told her. 10 days. You knew for 10 days, she said, still facing the window. Yes. And you didn't tell me. I was managing it. She turned around. You were managing it. Her voice was flat, not loud, flat, which was what her voice did when the anger went below a certain temperature and stopped being heat and started being something structural. I have been working on this case for 14 months. I have sacrificed. Do you understand the word sacrifice, Lucien? Or is that in a register you don't operate in? I have sacrificed 2 years of my life to build something that was clean and tight and airtight, and you knew for 10 days that there was a breach, and you managed it without telling me. If I'd told you, I could have adapted. She took a step toward him. I could have changed the approach. Moved the timeline myself, rebuilt the documentation chain. I have been doing this work every single day for over a year, and I am capable of— I know what you're capable of, he said, and something in the way he said it, direct, without cushioning, almost rough, stopped her mid-sentence. That's not why I didn't tell you. Then why? He looked at her, and she saw it again. That thing she'd seen in his face in the conference room 3 weeks ago and had chosen not to examine because examining it would have required her to confront what it meant. And what it meant was something she hadn't budgeted for in the architecture of what they were to each other. Because the night I found out about the breach, he said, was the night you came to the office at 2 a.m. with the wire transfer documents. And you were— He stopped, started again. You'd been working for 16 hours straight. You had a coffee stain on your sleeve and you hadn't noticed, and you were so focused on what you'd found that you were practically vibrating with it. A beat. I didn't tell you because you looked like the first time in 2 years that something had gone exactly right, and I did not want to be the one to take that from you. The room was very, very quiet. Selena stared at him. That, she said slowly, is the worst reason I have ever heard. I know. That is a completely unacceptable reason. I know. You do not get to protect me from information I need. I know, Selena. And this time her name in his mouth had a quality that was different from every other time he'd said it, and they both heard it, and neither of them addressed it directly because the situation was on fire, and that particular conversation required conditions that the situation did not currently provide. Her phone vibrated again. Claire, 32 minutes. They've wiped 3 servers. The offshore account documentation, the Cayman stuff. It's gone from their end. We still have our copies, but their lawyers will argue fabrication if ours is the only chain. She read it twice. Looked up. The Cayman documentation, she said. Do we have a clean, independent chain of custody? We have copies. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she felt the case. The thing she'd built. The architecture of 2 years. The 14-month precision instrument. Start to list sideways, the way a building lists when something load-bearing fails. Not collapse. Not yet. But the beginning of the feeling that collapse was a possibility she was now required to take seriously. The independent chain, Moretti said, depended on a source at the bank who provided originals directly to Claire's office. If Damien's team knows the timeline, they know the source. Is the source compromised? I don't know yet. Find out. My people are... Now, Lucien, find out now, because in 32 minutes, the digital documentation goes cold. And without the Cayman accounts, the fraud case drops from federal felony to financial mismanagement, which is what rich men's lawyers are specifically designed to survive. She was already moving toward the door. Get me the source status and get me Claire on the phone. I need to know what we still have. Selena. She stopped, hand on the door. I'm sorry, he said, for not telling you. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment and felt the full weight of it. Not just the breach, not just the 10 days, but all of it. The whole complex weight of what the last 14 months had actually been, underneath the strategy and the precision and the careful professional grammar they'd built around themselves. I know you are, she said. That helps less than you'd think. She opened the door and walked out. The private elevator took 40 seconds to reach the ballroom level, and in those 40 seconds, Selena stood alone in the small steel box and let herself feel it. The fear, the specific vertigo of watching something she'd built in careful increments begin to tremble. The rage at the 10 days, at the lawyer who'd made contact, at the fundamental truth that no matter how thoroughly you planned for every contingency, there was always a human element that could crack at the wrong temperature and under the wrong pressure. She felt it, all of it, for 38 seconds. Then the elevator opened and she walked into the ballroom, and her face was the same face she'd arrived with. Claire Soren answered on the first ring. Tell me about the bank source, Selena said, moving toward a quiet edge of the room, angling her body away from the nearest guests. Marcus Hale? Claire's voice had the tight quality of a woman suppressing urgency and not entirely succeeding. He's been our primary originator on the Cayman documentation. He provided physical copies directly to my office 6 months ago with a full chain of custody affidavit. Is he reachable right now? I've been trying for 20 minutes. His phone is going to voicemail. Something cold moved through Selena's chest. Marcus Hale, she said carefully. As in, any relation to Vanessa Hale's younger brother, Claire said. Yes. The cold in Selena's chest spread outward systematically, the way cold moves through a structure when the heat fails, reaching into the corners, getting into the walls. She stood very still in the ballroom while the party moved around her and processed the specific dimensions of what she was looking at. Marcus Hale, Vanessa Hale's younger brother. The bank source who had, 6 months ago, provided the documents that formed the spine of the fraud case, who had signed an affidavit, who was currently not answering his phone 20 minutes after Damien's legal team had been tipped off about the timeline. She'd vetted him. She had personally reviewed his background, his financial position, his relationship to the case, his motivation for cooperating. She'd spent 4 hours on it. She'd found no direct connection to Damien. Vanessa's relationship with Damien had post-dated Marcus's employment at the bank by 2 years, and Marcus had been estranged from his sister since the previous year over what appeared to be a genuine and documented family dispute. Appeared. Claire, she said, I need you to pull every communication record we have between Marcus Hale and anyone in the cross-capital orbit going back 18 months. Bank records, phone records, anything. That'll take 25 minutes, Selena said, which is what we have. Move. She hung up, looked around the ballroom, found Moretti on the far side, phone to his ear, his expression doing that thing it did when he was managing something that required the particular patience of someone who was very angry and very controlled simultaneously. Their eyes met across the room. He gave a slight shake of his head. The source wasn't reachable. She looked away, scanned the room, found Vanessa Hale near the bar, talking to a man Selena didn't recognize, holding a glass of wine with both hands in a way that looked casual but wasn't. There was a tightness in Vanessa's grip that suggested she was aware of something, waiting for something. Selena crossed the room. What? She reached Vanessa in 8 steps and didn't slow down and didn't give her time to recalibrate. Your brother, Selena said. Not a greeting, not a preamble, just that. The man Vanessa had been talking to took a step back, reading the atmosphere accurately, and found urgent business elsewhere. Vanessa's expression did something complicated. A quick sequence of reactions that moved through surprise and landed on something that was trying very hard to be innocent and was not quite making it. I don't know what you're... Vanessa. Selena moved closer. They were the same height, and this close, in the low light, she could see the exact moment when Vanessa decided to stop performing. Your brother signed an affidavit, your brother provided documents, and 20 minutes ago someone told Damien's lawyers everything, and now your brother isn't answering his phone. She held Vanessa's gaze. So I'm going to ask you one time, where is Marcus? I haven't talked to my brother in a year. That's not what I asked. I don't know where he is. Vanessa's voice had gone flat and careful, the register of someone choosing every word. And even if I did, why would I tell you anything? Because, Selena said, if Marcus recants that affidavit, or if it comes out that he had a prior relationship with Damien's people when he signed it, then the bank documents get thrown out and your fiancé walks. She paused. Your fiancé, who has been systematically looting the investment portfolios of people who trusted him, who has been covering losses with other people's money, who has been doing this for 4 years. Another pause. And if he walks, Vanessa, then the people whose money he took are going to want it back, and they're going to look at everyone who benefited from his lifestyle, and you have been living that lifestyle very visibly for 3 years. Vanessa stared at her. Her jaw was tight, her grip on the wine glass had gone white at the knuckle, and her eyes were doing the calculation that Selena had been watching people do all evening. The rapid interior arithmetic of a person who has just understood that the ground they're standing on is not what they thought it was. You're lying, Vanessa said. I've never lied to you, Selena said. That's actually a distinction between us. The wine glass made a small sound when Vanessa set it down on the nearest surface, almost a click, like something small and fragile making contact with something solid. He came to me, Vanessa said. Quiet, low, the voice of someone releasing pressure they'd been holding for a long time. 6 weeks ago, Marcus came to me. He said Damien's people had approached him, offered him money to sign a false retraction. He didn't want to do it. He was scared. What did you tell him? I told him to be careful. Her eyes were bright now, with something that wasn't composure. I told him Damien's people played rough. I told him... She stopped. I told him to come to me before he did anything. And did he? The brightness in Vanessa's eyes shifted. I don't know. He stopped returning my calls 2 weeks ago. I thought he was avoiding the whole situation. I didn't think... She stopped again. Her face had gone to a different place now, past calculation into something more basic and more human, the place where a person processes the possibility that someone they love has been placed in danger while they were busy attending parties in red dresses. I didn't think they'd actually... Where does he live? Selena asked. Brooklyn, Red Hook. He has an apartment on... Give me the address. Vanessa gave her the address. She was pale now, all the performance gone. Just a woman in an expensive dress who was beginning to understand that the consequences of the world she'd been living in had a much wider radius than she'd calculated. Selena typed the address into her phone. Sent it to Claire with 2 words. Send someone. Then she looked at Vanessa. This woman who had once stood in Selena's ballroom on Selena's anniversary night with her hand on Selena's husband's arm, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was nothing that resembled hatred. Just a tired, clear-eyed recognition that very few people in this world were entirely villains. Most of them were just people who had made convenient choices and hadn't looked at what those choices cost other people. If Marcus is okay, Selena said, and if he'll come in voluntarily and reconfirm the affidavit, there's still a path through this. And if he's not okay? Selena didn't answer that. She turned away. The next 20 minutes were the longest of her adult life. She moved through them with the mechanical focus of someone who has shut down everything non-essential and is operating purely on the core functions: the phone, the information, the decisions. Claire called twice. Moretti's team had located Marcus Hale. He was at his apartment, alive, unharmed, in what appeared to be a state of profound and complete emotional collapse. He'd been sitting on his kitchen floor for 2 hours with his phone off. He hadn't signed any retraction. He hadn't transferred any documents. He had simply, under the weight of a pressure that had been building for 6 weeks, stopped being able to function. That was what terror did to ordinary people. Not the dramatic breaking of a character, just the simple, undramatic inability to continue. Moretti's man talked to him for 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, Selena stood near the ballroom's east window, watching the city, breathing, not allowing herself to feel anything that wasn't immediately operational. Then her phone buzzed. "He'll do it. He'll come in tonight. He wants protective custody." She exhaled, slow, deliberate, all the way out. "Claire," she said when the attorney picked up, "we still have the affidavit. The source is intact. Call the U.S. Attorney's office and tell them we're ready." A pause. "Yes, tonight." She hung up. She stood there for a moment with her phone at her side and her eyes on the window and the city beyond it, and felt, underneath the exhaustion, underneath the residual terror of what the last 40 minutes had been, something approaching solid ground. Fragile, temporary, but solid. "It's going to hold," said Moretti's voice behind her. She turned. He was there, close enough that the conversation was private, far enough that it was not yet something else. "We have 18 minutes before the federal team arrives," he said. "The raid is back on the original timeline. Claire has the documentation secured. Marcus Hale is in a car heading to the federal building." He looked at her carefully. "It's going to hold, Selena." She looked at him, at the specific quality of his face in this moment. Not triumph, not relief, just the contained structural steadiness of a man who had built his life around surviving difficult nights and knew how to be present in them. "The breach," she said. "Your lawyer. He's been removed from the case." A pause. "And from my employ. And the federal inquiries, the ones they were offering to make disappear. We'll proceed normally." He held her gaze. "I didn't take the deal. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. And she did know, had known it, really, from the moment he told her. Because if Moretti had taken the deal, she would not currently be standing in this ballroom watching the case survive. If he'd taken the deal, she'd be driving home right now with nothing. "That doesn't entirely resolve the 10 days. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They stood in a silence that had too much in it for either of them to navigate cleanly in the middle of a collapsing plan on a party floor with 20 minutes before a federal raid. Then Selena's phone buzzed one more time, and this time it wasn't Claire. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, young, slightly unsteady. "Miss Vaughn?" Marcus Hale, in the car. His voice had the hollow quality of someone who'd been through something and wasn't all the way back yet. "I need to tell you something. Something that... It's not in any of the documents. It's something Damien told me directly 2 weeks ago when he was trying to turn me." "I'm listening," she said. She met Moretti's eyes, put the call on speaker. "He told me..." Marcus stopped, started again. "He told me that the reason he went after you so hard after the divorce, the reason he made the calls, tanked your reputation, made sure no one would hire you." A breath. "He said it wasn't because you'd become a liability. He said it was because he'd found out about something you'd done before the marriage." Another breath. "He said he had documentation. He called it..." The young man's voice dropped slightly, as if even repeating the phrase gave him pause. "He called it his insurance policy." The ballroom continued around her. The music, the laughter, the clink of glass on glass. "What documentation?" Selena said carefully. "I don't know. He didn't tell me what it was, just that it existed and that if you came after him, he'd use it. He said..." Marcus paused. He said you knew what it was. He said if you heard the phrase, the Meridian account, you'd understand. The Meridian account. The two words landed in Selena's chest like a physical impact. Not because she didn't know what they referred to, but precisely because she did. Because the Meridian account was something that predated her marriage, predated Cross Capital, predated every single thing she had built in the last 14 years, and was connected to a period of her life she had spent a decade and a half ensuring would never surface. She looked at Moretti. His expression had not changed, but his eyes were asking a question, and the question was the same one she was now facing, and it had no version of a clean answer. Because the Meridian account was not something she could explain away. It was not something that could be managed with forensic accountants or careful legal strategy or the patient architectural work of 14 months. It was the one thing she had never prepared for because she had convinced herself, had genuinely believed, with the particular willful certainty of someone who has spent long enough running from something, that it was buried deep enough to stay buried, and Damien Cross had been sitting on it for 3 years, which meant that what she had thought was a war she was winning had also been, from the very beginning, a war she had been losing in a direction she hadn't thought to look. She lowered the phone. Outside the ballroom window, the first of the federal vehicles was pulling silently into position on the street below. Dark SUVs with no lights running, moving into the geometry of the night like something patient and inevitable. The raid was beginning. The case was holding. The thing she'd built for 2 years was about to do what she'd designed it to do. And none of it mattered at all if Damien Cross walked into a courtroom and opened the file on the Meridian account. Lucien Moretti was watching her with that unreadable quality of stillness, and she could see in his face that he understood something significant had just changed and was waiting, not impatiently, but with the full weight of his attention, for her to tell him what it was. She looked at him, and the woman who had spent 3 years building herself into something untouchable understood, in this moment, with absolute and terrible clarity, that she was going to have to make a choice that no amount of planning, no amount of precision, no amount of strategic architecture could make for her. She was going to have to decide how much of herself she was willing to burn to win this, and whether what was left on the other side of that burning was still something she recognized as herself at all. The string quartet started a new piece below. Selena Vaughn stood in the middle of everything, in her black gown and her diamonds, with the case holding and the raid beginning and the man beside her waiting, and knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone standing at the absolute edge of a point of no return that the version of herself who had walked into this building tonight was the last version of herself that got to be innocent about what came next. She told him, not all of it, not yet, but enough. They were standing in the same alcove where she'd found her breath an hour ago, behind the decorative column, the ballroom noise pressing in from every direction like something physical. And she spoke in a low, flat voice and watched Lucien Moretti's face while she did it, and did not look away once because she had made a decision in the 4 seconds between Marcus Hale saying the Meridian account and her lowering the phone, the decision that whatever came next, she was not going to survive it by hiding. She'd tried hiding. Hiding was what got you to the place where a man could use your past as a weapon. 12 years ago, she said, before the marriage. I was working for a financial consulting firm in Boston. Small operation, boutique clients, the kind of place that handled money for people who needed it, handled quietly. Moretti was listening. Just listening. The way he did, with his whole body still and his eyes completely present. One of our clients was a man named Victor Crane. Old money, offshore holdings, the kind of portfolio that had layers specifically designed to make it difficult to follow. I was 26. I was the best analyst they had, and I knew it, and I was... She stopped, chose the honest word. Hungry. The kind of hungry that makes you rationalize things you shouldn't rationalize. What did you do? He asked. No judgment in it, just the question, direct and clean. Crane asked me to restructure a series of accounts, move capital between entities in a pattern that would make the origin points untraceable. I knew what it was. I wasn't naive. I knew what that kind of restructuring was for. She looked at him steadily. I did it anyway. I documented it internally under a project code I created. The Meridian account. It ran for 8 months. Then Crane died. Heart attack. Completely unrelated. And the accounts went dormant, and the firm dissolved 2 years later, And I walked away and spent the next decade building something clean on top of it. Moretti was quiet for a moment. How bad is the documentation? He asked. Bad enough. She said it without flinching. It's not criminal in the active sense. The statute of limitations ran out years ago. But it's the kind of thing that destroys credibility completely. In the context of a federal fraud trial, if Damien's lawyers introduce it as character evidence, as a pattern of financial manipulation, it poisons the entire case. Every document I touched, every analysis I provided, every piece of testimony that references my role in building this case becomes tainted. She paused. And it hands his defense team a narrative that I'm not a victim seeking justice. I'm a corrupt former insider with a vendetta. The string quartet had stopped. Someone was making a speech somewhere in the ballroom. The acoustics carried the cadence without the words, a murmur of authority rising and falling. Does Claire know? Moretti asked. No one knows, except Damien, and now you. He looked at her. In the low light and the noise and the compressed space of the alcove, there was no version of this conversation that wasn't completely stripped of performance, and she was aware of that, and aware that she was standing in front of him with the worst thing about herself laid out on the table between them, like a document she'd finally stopped hiding. Why are you telling me? He asked. Because in approximately 11 minutes, federal agents are going to walk into this building and arrest Damien Cross, she said. And if he gets in front of a lawyer in the next 20 minutes, the first thing he is going to do is authorize the release of that documentation to his defense team. And when that happens, I need to already have a response prepared. She held his gaze. And I can't prepare a response alone. Not in 11 minutes. Not for this. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the full weight of it. The exposure of standing in front of someone who could, with the information she'd just given him, destroy her as effectively as Damien could. More effectively, maybe, because Moretti had resources and reach, and the specific capabilities of a man who had spent his career in the mechanisms of power. All right, he said, just that. She exhaled. The documentation Damien has, Moretti said, already moving into operational mode. She could see the shift, the way his focus narrowed and sharpened. Physical copies, digital, or both? I don't know. Where would he keep something like that? Not at the office. The office is about to be raided. His apartment, or his lawyer's safe, she thought. Or on him. Damien has a habit of carrying leverage physically when he feels threatened. A flash drive, something he can access without going through a system that could be seized. Moretti's jaw shifted slightly. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced his phone, typed something brief. Sent it. My people are watching him, he said. If he makes a move toward the exit, he can't leave before the arrest. If he runs, it adds flight charges and it looks like consciousness of guilt. He might not care what it looks like at this point. Moretti's phone buzzed. He read the screen. He's still in the ballroom, near the north exit. He's been on his phone for the last 6 minutes. His lawyer, she said. Almost certainly. They looked at each other. I have to go talk to him, she said. Selena, before the agents arrive, before he lawyers up completely and the documentation gets authorized for release. She was already moving, thinking ahead, building the geometry of it. If I can get him to hold the Meridian material, even temporarily, it gives us room to manage the narrative before it becomes public. And why would he hold it? Because I'm going to offer him something he wants more than destroying me. What could you possibly... His freedom, she said. Or the appearance of it. He doesn't know yet how tight the case is. He doesn't know Marcus confirmed the affidavit. He thinks he still has leverage. I'm going to let him keep thinking that for about 5 minutes. Moretti grabbed her arm. Not hard. Nothing like Damien's grip on the terrace. Just a firm, immediate contact that stopped her forward motion. She turned. This is not a good plan, he said. I know, she said. If he's already talked to his lawyer, releasing the Meridian documentation is out of his hands. You'd be walking into a conversation with a man who has nothing to lose by... I know, Lucien. She looked at his hand on her arm. He released it. I don't have a better option, and neither do you, and we have 9 minutes. He looked at her. The muscles in his jaw were tight. I'll be 12 feet away, he said. If anything, 12 feet is fine, she said. Just don't intervene unless I signal. What's the signal? I'll put my left hand on the back of a chair. That's too subtle. It's a ballroom, not a combat zone. She held his gaze. 12 feet, that's all I need. She turned and walked toward the north end of the ballroom, and her heart was doing something violent and irregular in her chest that she ignored the way you ignore a fire alarm when you're already running toward the building. Damien Cross was standing near a pillar, phone in hand, jacket slightly less perfect than it had been 2 hours ago. The entropy of a long evening and a bad hour showing in the small details. He saw her coming. She watched him calculate whether to move away and decide against it, because moving away was admitting something, and Damien Cross had never been able to admit anything without a lawyer in the room. She stopped 3 feet from him, standard social distance, unthreatening geometry. "Whatever you're about to say," he started. "The Meridian account," she said. He stopped. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was genuinely surprised. A brief, unmanaged stillness, just a half second before the management came back. But she'd seen it. It was real. "You're bluffing," he said. "You told Marcus Hale you had documentation. You said if I heard those words, I'd understand." She kept her voice completely level. "I understand, Damien. I'm not bluffing." He looked at her for a moment. The ballroom noise surrounded them. Glasses and conversations and the ambient sound of privilege in motion. And inside all of it, they were standing in a pocket of something that felt nothing like any of it. "Then you know what happens next," he said. "I know what you think happens next. Your entire case falls apart." He said it quietly, with the specific satisfaction of a man who has been holding something for a long time and is finally getting to use it. Every document you touched, every analysis, every piece of testimony connected to your involvement, tainted, all of it. He tilted his head slightly. "My lawyers release the Meridian file, and you stop being a victim and start being a co-conspirator with a personal motive. And the jury—" "There isn't going to be a jury tonight," she said. He paused. "Tonight," she said, "there's going to be an arrest that's already in motion, and there's nothing you or your lawyers can do to stop it in the next—" She didn't check her watch. 8 minutes. "The documentation chain is intact. Marcus Hale has confirmed his affidavit. The federal team is staged." She watched him process this. "The Meridian file doesn't stop the arrest, Damien. It just changes what happens after. After is all that matters. Maybe." She took one small step closer. "Or maybe the man who walks into federal custody tonight, having just released damaging personal information about his ex-wife, the sympathetic ex-wife, the one who left a hotel in the rain, the one the press has been quietly rooting for, maybe that man looks a lot more like someone trying to destroy a witness than someone with a legitimate defense." She held his gaze. "And federal prosecutors don't like witness intimidation. They charge it separately." His expression had shifted. The satisfaction was still there, but it was competing with something else now. The recalculation, the arithmetic, the thing that happened in Damien Cross's eyes when the ground beneath a position he'd taken started to feel less stable than he'd assessed. "You're scared," he said. "Yes," she said. The honesty of it surprised him. She saw that, saw it land, saw him adjust. "Then you know the file destroys you," he said. "It damages me," she said. "There's a difference. And damage I can survive. I've been surviving damage for 3 years." She looked at him, at the man she'd married, at the face she'd woken up next to for 7 years, at the person who had stood in a ballroom with his mistress on their anniversary and watched her walk out into the rain and had not followed. "The question is whether you want to spend whatever happens next trying to damage me further, or whether you want to spend it trying to save what's left of yourself." His jaw tightened. There's nothing left to save. There might be, depending on how the next 30 minutes go. She let that sit. If you cooperate, genuinely, substantively, if you give them the full picture of the offshore structure, if you name the people above you in the scheme, because we both know you're not the top of this, Damien, you never were, then the sentencing calculus changes dramatically. The Meridian file doesn't help you with that. It just makes noise. He stared at her, the stare of a man who had spent years being the smartest person in most rooms and was currently in a room where that might not be true. "You're asking me to cooperate," he said slowly, "against my own. I'm telling you the Meridian file is a weapon that hurts you more than it hurts me if you use it tonight." Her voice was quiet and completely steady. That's not a negotiation. That's information. What you do with it is your choice. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something move through Damien Cross's face that she hadn't seen there in a very long time. Something that predated the company and the money and the corruption and the anniversary party and all of it. Something human and frightened and genuinely lost. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His lawyer. He looked at her. "I have to take this," he said. "I know," she said. She stepped back. Let him have the space. Turned slightly away to give him the privacy of the call, though she stayed close enough to watch his posture. The way his shoulders changed when he put the phone to his ear, the way his body absorbed whatever his lawyer was telling him, the micro-adjustments of a man receiving information in real time. She felt Moretti before she saw him, that particular shift in the air nearby that she'd come to associate with his presence over 14 months of working alongside him. He materialized at her peripheral vision, 8 feet away, watching Damien with the specific quality of attention of a man calculating odds. Damien's posture changed, stiffened. Then, and she caught this barely from the side, his free hand went to his inside jacket pocket. Checked something there. The reflex of a man confirming the location of something he was carrying. Flash drive. It had to be. Her eyes went to Moretti. He'd seen it too. And then everything happened in a compressed sequence that her memory would later have difficulty organizing into the right order. The main entrance to the ballroom opened, not the way guests entered, not with the social noise of arrival, but with the hard declarative authority of people who had a purpose that superseded the social contract of the event. 4 federal agents in dark jackets moved into the room with the focused efficiency of professionals who had done this before and were not interested in performance. Behind them, 2 more. The conversations nearest the entrance stopped first, the silence spreading outward through the crowd like something dropped in water, reaching the center of the room in about 4 seconds. Selena heard the shift before she could fully process it. Damien heard it too. He lowered his phone, turned, saw the agents. She watched his face go through a sequence of responses in about 2 seconds. Recognition, calculation, something that might have been relief or might have been terror, the 2 things living close enough together in a moment like this that they were nearly indistinguishable. He looked at her. "You said 8 minutes," he said. "I was wrong," she said. His hand went back to his jacket pocket, that reflexive check again. And this time he didn't stop at checking. His fingers closed around something inside the pocket, and she knew, with the instinctive certainty of someone who had spent 2 years studying this man, exactly what he was about to do. "Don't," she said. Not loud, just that one word. He looked at her. The hand stayed in the pocket. "That file," she said, "is the only leverage you have left. The moment you release it, you have nothing to negotiate with, nothing to trade." She held his gaze with everything she had. Not pleading, not performing, just the raw, direct current of 2 people who had known each other for years and were now at the absolute end of something. "Keep it. Use it as a bargaining chip with the prosecutors. Don't waste it on me." The agents had identified him now. She could see their trajectory, the purposeful angle crossing the room. 30 seconds. Maybe less. Damien Cross looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, she could not have told you with any certainty what he was going to do. Because the truth was that she had never been able to fully read him. That had been the central failure of 7 years, the thing that had made the anniversary party possible, the thing that had made all of it possible. And standing here at the end, she was just a woman who had made the best argument she could and was now waiting to find out whether it had been enough. His hand came out of his pocket, empty. The agents reached him 8 seconds later. She stepped back, watched the lead agent speak to him. Quiet, professional. The choreography of an arrest conducted in a public space with minimum theater. Damien's hands went behind his back. His face was very still. He didn't look at her again. The room had gone to a low, stunned murmur. The sound of 200 people processing something they hadn't anticipated and weren't sure how to respond to yet. Selena stood in the middle of it and felt her knees want to give and refuse to let them. Moretti was at her side in seconds, not touching her, just present, close, his voice low near her ear. "Are you—" "The drive," she said. "He has it on him. His inside left jacket pocket. When they process him—" "I'll make a call." Make sure the legal team is notified to flag it. It can't be seized as evidence unless it's relevant to the fraud charges. His lawyers will argue privilege. I know. His voice was steady. We'll deal with it. Lucien. She turned to look at him. If that file surfaces, we'll deal with it, he said again. And this time, the steadiness in it was not professional and not strategic. It was something else, something she'd been refusing to name for 14 months, because naming it would have complicated everything, and she had not been able to afford complications. She looked at his face. Why? She said. After everything I just told you. The Meridian account. What I did. Why? Because 12 years ago, you made a bad choice when you were 26 and hungry, and nobody had taught you yet that that kind of hunger had a cost, he said. His voice was quiet and completely direct. And you've spent 14 years building something clean on top of it, and then 2 years tearing yourself apart to make something right. He held her gaze. I've done worse things than you have, Selena. For worse reasons. She stared at him. Across the room, Damien Cross was being guided toward the exit. The crowd parted. Someone's champagne glass hit the floor with a clean, bright sound that rang out across the ballroom and then was absorbed back into the murmur. There's still the drive, she said. Yes. And if his lawyers get to it first, then we handle that when it happens. He looked at her with a directness that asked nothing and deflected nothing. Stop planning 3 moves ahead for 30 seconds. I can't, she said. If I stop... I know, he said, but you're shaking. She looked down at her hands. He was right. The fine tremor that she'd been suppressing for the last 40 minutes had finally surfaced. Not dramatic, not visible to anyone more than 2 feet away, but there. Real. She closed her fingers into her palms. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. The people above Damien in the scheme, he wasn't the top. I know he wasn't. There's a capital source that the offshore restructuring was protecting, and it's bigger than Cross Capital. I've been following a thread for 3 months, and it leads somewhere that... She stopped, looked at him. It leads somewhere that involves people you know, Lucien. People in your world. The quality of his stillness changed in a way that was almost imperceptible and entirely legible to her. How far up? He asked. Far enough that when I show you what I've found, you're going to have to make a decision about whether we keep going. She held his gaze without flinching. And it's a decision I can't make for you. The ballroom was still processing the arrest. Voices rising now, phones coming out, the machinery of gossip and documentation cranking into motion. The federal agents had cleared the main floor. The enormous, glittering, expensive event had cracked down its middle, and everyone in it was either moving toward the exits or standing very still, trying to figure out which way the story was going to land. In the center of it, Selena Vaughn looked at Lucien Moretti and watched him absorb what she'd just told him. Watched him take it in with that unreadable stillness, that particular quality of processing that she'd spent 14 months learning to read and still didn't fully understand. She had won tonight. She knew that. The arrest was real, the case was intact, the evidence chain would hold. But the thing she'd uncovered in 3 months of following the money, the thing at the end of the thread above Damien Cross, was going to require a different kind of war. A longer one. One that went further into territory she had never planned to enter. And the man standing in front of her was either going to be the most important ally she had in fighting it, or the reason she couldn't. Moretti looked at her for a long moment. Show me what you found, he said. She reached into her clutch, produced a single folded piece of paper, 1 page printed, a summary document she'd carried for 3 weeks without knowing when the right moment to use it would be. She held it out. He took it, unfolded it, read it, and she watched his face in the fractured golden light of the Sterling Crown ballroom go through something she had never seen there before. Not the managed stillness, not the professional calculation, not even the brief unguarded moments she'd witnessed over 14 months. Something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine fear. He looked up from the paper. Where did you get this? He asked. I built it, she said, the same way I built everything else, 1 thread at a time. Selena. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. The name at the bottom of this page. Do you understand who that is? Yes, she said. Do you understand what he's capable of? I have a general idea. No. He folded the paper, held it. You don't. Not yet. He looked at her with something that had stopped being professional a long time ago and was only now being fully acknowledged. If we go after this man, if we follow this thread where it goes, there is no version of this that ends cleanly. There is no version where everyone walks away. She looked at him. I know, she said. The word we had been in his sentence. She'd heard it. He'd heard himself say it. The air between them held everything that hadn't been said in 14 months, compressed into this single moment in a ballroom that smelled of champagne and consequence, with the wreckage of one man's empire still settling around them and the outline of something larger and more dangerous waiting on the other side of a single folded piece of paper. There's a car outside, Moretti said. His voice had steadied. We need to get out of here before the press gets the perimeter locked down. He looked at her. And then you're going to tell me everything, from the beginning, every thread. She nodded. They moved toward the exit, and the crowd parted for them the way it had parted for Damien Cross 20 minutes ago, but differently. Not the parting for a man being taken out. The parting for two people walking out of their own accord, carrying something between them that wasn't finished yet. At the exit, Selena paused, turned back. One last look at the room, the tilted chandeliers, the half-empty champagne glasses, the beautiful wreckage of an evening that had gone exactly as planned and nothing like she'd expected. The Sterling Crown Hotel, where 3 years ago she had walked out into the rain and believed, with every cell in her body, that everything was over. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she turned away and walked out into the cold Manhattan night, beside the most dangerous man in the city, carrying a folded piece of paper that was either the beginning of something or the end of everything, and feeling, underneath the exhaustion and the residual terror and the fine tremor in her hands that still hadn't entirely stopped, the particular electricity of a person who has just realized that the war they thought they were finishing was actually only the awesome. The car was cold, not the kind of cold that came from a broken heater, the kind that came from two people sitting in an enclosed space carrying things that hadn't been spoken yet, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with what happened when the adrenaline of a long night finally started to ebb and left behind only the weight of what remained. Moretti's driver knew better than to speak. The partition went up without being asked. Manhattan moved past the windows in its indifferent way. The streetlights, the late-night pedestrians, the city doing what it always did, which was continue without reference to the specific private catastrophes occurring within it. Selena sat on her side of the seat and looked out the window and listened to her own breathing slow down from the pace it had been running at for the last 3 hours. The paper was in Moretti's inside jacket pocket now. Neither of them had spoken since the hotel entrance. She broke it first, because she'd always been the one who broke silences when they stopped being useful. The name at the bottom, she said. Thomas Rael. Moretti was looking at his hands, forearms resting on his knees in that particular posture of his, contained, forward, like a man perpetually ready to respond to something. He didn't look up. How long have you known? He asked. 3 months of knowing, 6 months of suspecting. She turned from the window to look at him directly. He's the capital source behind the Cayman restructuring. The money that Damien was using to cover his losses didn't originate with Damien. It came through 4 layers of shell companies that all eventually trace back to a holding entity that Rael controls through a nominee directorship in Luxembourg. She paused. Damien was a vehicle, Lucien. A very profitable, very convenient vehicle. When the vehicle started breaking down, Rael's people were the ones who applied pressure. They were the ones who approached my lawyer, Moretti said. Yes, not Damien's team. Damien's team was acting on Rael's instruction. She watched his face. Damien probably doesn't even know how far up the chain goes. He thinks he made his own choices. He doesn't understand that his choices were being managed from above for the last 4 years. Moretti was quiet. The car turned onto a cross street heading west. Thomas Rael, he said again, not repeating it for her benefit, saying it to himself in the tone of a man taking the full measure of something he'd been handed. She knew the name's weight in his world. Rael operated in the stratum above Moretti, not criminally, or not only criminally, but in that gray architectural space where legitimate finance and illegitimate influence became indistinguishable from each other. He was 70 years old. He had survived 4 presidential administrations and 3 separate federal investigations without a single charge. He had people in places that made Moretti's network look like a neighborhood organization. "If we go after him," she started. "We need to be more prepared than we were tonight," Moretti said. "By a significant margin." "I know. The federal case against Damien won't touch Rael. The shell company structure is clean enough that Damien's cooperation, even full cooperation, only gets prosecutors to the 3rd layer. Rael is at layer 7. I know that too. So what are you proposing?" She reached into her clutch and produced a small USB drive. Matte black, unmarked, the kind you could buy in any electronics shop. She held it between 2 fingers. "Everything I have is on this," she said. "The full 6 months of thread following, the Luxembourg entity, the nominee directorship, the financial flow analysis, the connection points." She paused. "And something else. Something I found 4 weeks ago that I haven't told Claire, haven't told anyone, because I wasn't sure what to do with it yet." He looked at the drive. At her. "What is it?" he asked. "Rael has a whistleblower problem he doesn't know about yet," she said. "An internal accountant at the Luxembourg entity. A woman named Diane Foss, Belgian national, 43 years old, 12 years with the firm. She's been quietly documenting irregularities for 18 months. She hasn't gone to authorities because she's terrified, and she has a daughter in secondary school in Brussels, and she understands what the risks are." She looked at him steadily. "I made contact with her 6 weeks ago through an intermediary. She's willing to talk, to the right people with the right protections. Moretti looked at the drive for a long moment. "You've been running a parallel operation," he said. "Yes." "While running the Damien case?" "Yes." He looked up at her. "By yourself?" "I didn't want to—" She stopped, chose the honest version. "I didn't know yet whether I could trust the full picture to anyone. The Damien case was compromised at the edges. Your lawyer, the timeline breach. If Rael's people were already applying pressure on your organization, I couldn't assume the second layer was safe." The silence that followed was a different kind than the one that had started the drive. This one had texture, history in it. "You were protecting the operation," he said. "I was protecting everything," she said, "including you." He looked at her. She held his gaze and didn't qualify it or walk it back, because it was true, and because they were both too tired for the careful grammar of professional distance, and because somewhere between the terrace and the arrest and the folded piece of paper and the drive in her hand, the careful grammar had stopped being something either of them were maintaining. He reached out and took the drive from her fingers. Their hands were close for a moment, not touching, just close. The particular proximity of people who have been building toward a single point for a long time and are now finally standing at it. "We'll need 4 weeks minimum," he said, "to build a protection structure for Fosse that actually holds. Something multi-jurisdictional, something that can't be unwound by a single phone call from someone with Rael's reach." "I know. And the Meridian file, we need to address that before it resurfaces." "I know that too. I have a lawyer, not the one who made contact, a different one, someone I trust with the architecture of my own exposure, who handles situations where past decisions become present problems. She's quiet, and she's good, and she won't judge you." He met her eyes. "It won't disappear, but it can be positioned." Selena looked at him, at the matter-of-fact way he was handling the worst thing about her, not as a revelation that required processing, not as leverage, not as a reason to recalibrate their arrangement, just as a problem with a structure to it and therefore a solution to be found. "You're very practical about other people's catastrophes," she said. "I've had a lot of practice," he said. Something in his face shifted. The edge of something that was not quite a smile but lived near it, including my own. The car was slowing. She looked out the window. They were in the West Village, the brownstone street that housed Petra Hals's consulting office, which was where, 14 months ago, this had all begun in the back of a car with a stale sandwich and a coffee stain on her sleeve. She hadn't asked where they were going. She realized that now. She'd just gotten in. "Why here?" she asked. "Petra has a secure room. Server isolated, no external lines, documented legal privilege." He glanced at her. "We're going to go over everything on that drive tonight, all of it, because 4 weeks from now, when we move on Rael, I need to know every corner of what we're walking into. He paused. And so do you. She looked at the brownstone. The lights were on in the upper floors. Petra was awake, or had been woken, more likely, which meant Moretti had sent ahead during the drive. Lucien, she said. He stopped reaching for the door handle, turned. She looked at him, at the face she'd been looking at for 14 months, and had spent most of that time deliberately not seeing clearly, because clearly was complicated, and complicated was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford. She looked at it now. The specific gravity of it, the intelligence, the controlled power, and underneath all of that, somewhere considerably less defended than the surface. The things she'd seen on the balcony, and in the conference room, and in a dozen small, unguarded moments that she'd filed away and left unaddressed. The 10 days, she said, when you didn't tell me about the breach. He held her gaze. Yes. You said it was because I looked like something had gone right and you didn't want to take that from me. Yes. That was still wrong, she said. I need you to understand that, not as a professional failing, as… She stopped, found the right word. As a person. If we're going to do this, whatever this is, I need information, all of it, even when it's bad, especially when it's bad. She looked at him steadily. I'm not fragile. I know I looked at that night. I know there are moments when I look like I'm one more thing away from the edge, but I'm not fragile, and I need you to not treat me like I am. He looked at her for a moment. You're one of the least fragile people I've ever met, he said. That night wasn't about fragility. Then what was it about? He was quiet, the honest quiet of a man choosing between the manageable answer and the true one. It was about the fact that for 14 months I've been watching you work yourself to the bone for something that started as a transaction and stopped being one a long time ago, he said. And I've been doing my job, which was to support the operation, and doing it well. But that night I stopped being able to do only my job. He paused. And that made me stupid about the information. Not protective, stupid. The word landed without decoration. Stupid. A man calling himself stupid in the plain, declarative tone of someone taking honest inventory. She looked at him. Okay, she said. Okay? That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 14 months, she said. I'm choosing to take it as a positive indicator. Something shifted in his face. The thing adjacent to a smile moved closer to the actual thing. Come on, he said. Petra's waiting. They spent 4 hours in the secure room. Selena walked Moretti through everything on the drive. The full 6 months of financial thread following, the Luxembourg entity, the nominee structure, the pattern of capital movement that connected Thomas Rael to the Cayman accounts to Cross Capital's concealed losses. She spoke in the flat, efficient cadence she used when she was operating on the functional register, the one she'd developed over 14 months of midnight briefings. And Moretti listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, with the occasional sharp question that told her exactly where his attention was sharpest. Petra Halsey sat at the corner of the table with a legal pad and said almost nothing and wrote down more than Selena expected. At 2 a.m, they got to Diane Fossey. Selena walked through the contact carefully. The intermediary, the 6 weeks of careful communication, the nature of the documentation Fossey had been maintaining, the specific exposure it created for Rael's Luxembourg entity. When she finished, there was a silence in which Moretti and Petra both sat with what they'd just been given and looked at it from several angles. She needs a relocation package, Moretti said finally, her and the daughter, before we make any move. Agreed, Selena said. New identities or just relocation? New identities. Rael's reach in Brussels is too long for relocation alone. That's a 6-week minimum, not 4. Then 6 weeks. Moretti looked at Petra. Some private communication passed between them that Selena was not party to but understood by its outcome, which was Petra nodding once and writing something on the legal pad. There's a secondary problem, Selena said. The Damien arrest tonight is going to generate press coverage by morning. The connection to Cross Capital's offshore structure will become public. When Rael's people see the coverage, they're going to start assessing exposure. They may move on Fossey preemptively. How quickly can you establish communication with her? Moretti asked. I can reach the intermediary in 12 hours. Do it in 6. He looked at her. Tonight. It's 3 a.m. in Brussels. Wake her up, he said simply. This is a wake her up situation. She looked at him. Yes, she said. It is. She made the call from the secure room at 2:17 in the morning, speaking in French that was good enough to be functional and not good enough to be mistaken for native, which had the unintended effect of making the intermediary, a woman named Sophie, who ran a legitimate legal translation service in Ghent, and asked no questions about the nature of her clients' relationships. Take the call more seriously, because people who spoke careful foreign language French at 2 in the morning about important things tended to mean the important things. The message would reach Foss by morning. Sophie would make sure of that. When she hung up, the exhaustion hit her in a wave, not the manageable tiredness of a long night, but the deeper structural exhaustion of a person whose body had been running on cortisol and intention for an extended period, and was now, in the quiet of a secure room in the West Village at 2:20 in the morning, finally presenting the bill. She set the phone down, put both palms flat on the table, breathed. Petra, reading the room with the accuracy of a woman who had spent decades reading rooms, stood quietly, said she'd arranged transportation, and left. The room was very still. Go home, Moretti said. Not unkindly. I need to call Claire first. Check the status of... Claire is a professional. The status is managed. Go home. The Meridian file? Selena. His voice was quiet and carried no impatience. I told you. We'll deal with it. When? This week. My lawyer will reach out to you tomorrow. He paused. Today? Later today. She looked at the table, at her own hands on it, the diamonds still on her fingers, the black satin still intact, the whole architecture of the evening's performance still assembled on her body while everything underneath had been completely rearranged. I've been afraid of that file for 12 years, she said. Not looking at him, just saying it to the table, to the room, to the honest air of a place that had been designed specifically for honesty. I built everything on top of it like if I stacked enough clean work on top of the thing I'd done wrong, it would eventually stop being there. That's what most people do, Moretti said. Does it work? He was quiet for a moment. It works until it doesn't, he said, and then you deal with what's underneath. She looked up at him. Have you dealt with what's underneath? Some of it. He met her eyes. Not all of it. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had built a life in the gray architecture of power and danger and had somewhere inside that life maintained a capacity for honesty that she hadn't expected when she'd walked into a restaurant in Tribeca 14 months ago and sat down across from him without being invited to and said things she hadn't planned to say. The man who had made a bad call about 10 days and called himself stupid for it without flinching. The man who had stood on a balcony in the cold and said, "You touched my wife," in the tone of someone stating a meteorological fact. The man who had looked at the worst thing about her and said, "We'll deal with it," and meant both words equally. She was aware, in the still and honest quiet of the secure room, that she had spent 14 months constructing reasons why this was not a thing she was doing, why the careful professional distance was real rather than performed, why the 14 months of close work and shared purpose and midnight meetings and 100 small moments of something that wasn't strategy had not accumulated into something she was going to be required to address. She'd always been very good at constructing things, sometimes too good. I should go home, she said. Yes, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she stood, picked up her clutch, smoothed the front of her dress in the automatic gesture of a woman putting herself back together for a public-facing world, even at 2 in the morning in a private room. He stood when she did. That old-fashioned reflex. She'd noticed it before and never commented on it, the way you didn't comment on things that revealed something honest about a person. Lucien, she said. He waited. She looked at him. The words she actually wanted to say sat in her chest in the specific, uncomfortable way of things that were true and also required courage to say, and she was exhausted and the courage was finite and she had used a significant portion of it tonight. So she said the version she had the energy for. Thank you, she said, for tonight, for the last 14 months. She paused. For not running when I told you about the Meridian account. He looked at her steadily. That's not something you thank someone for. Why not? Because it means you thought I might. Something in his voice. I wouldn't have. She held his gaze. "I know that now," she said. The car Petra had arranged was waiting outside. She rode home alone through the empty 3 in the morning streets, watching the city do its nocturnal thing. The delivery trucks, the night shift workers, the particular quality of light at this hour that stripped the glamour off everything and left only the skeleton, which was actually, she'd always thought, the more honest version of the city. She got home at 3:12. She hung the black gown in the closet, put the diamonds in their case, washed her face, and stood at the bathroom mirror for a long moment and looked at the version of herself that remained after the makeup and the armor came off. The lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, the set of her jaw that was different from before, harder and more deliberate, shaped by the specific work of surviving things you hadn't chosen. She didn't feel victorious. She'd expected to feel victorious. She'd imagined this night hundreds of times, and in every imagined version, there had been a moment of triumph. Clean, cinematic, earned. What she actually felt was something more complicated and more real. The exhaustion, yes. And underneath it, something that was cautiously approaching relief. And underneath that, the particular feeling of someone who has set down a very heavy thing they've been carrying for a long time and is now assessing the permanent changes carrying it has made to the shape of their body. She went to bed. She slept. The press coverage broke by 7 in the morning. She read it with coffee at the kitchen table, the same table where 6 months ago she'd been eating breakfast alone in the quiet of her earned space and trying to feel like it was enough. The coverage was substantial. The arrest of Damien Cross at the Black Orchid Gala, the federal fraud charges, the offshore account structure, the names of the investors who had already been in contact with federal prosecutors. Gerald Fitch was quoted briefly. Paul Wesson was not quoted but was described as cooperating. The coverage of the arrest itself was cinematic. Several guests had taken video, and the footage of federal agents crossing the Sterling Crown ballroom was already generating the kind of viewership that fed on spectacle. Selena's name appeared in the 6th paragraph of the first article she read. Selena Vaughn, Damien Cross's former wife and a former executive at Cross Capital, was present at the gala and is believed to have assisted federal investigators in building the case over the course of the past year. Ms. Vaughn declined to comment. She hadn't declined to comment. She simply hadn't been asked yet. She set her phone down and finished her coffee. Claire called at 8. The case was solid, she said. The arrest had gone cleanly. The documentation chain was intact. Marcus Hale had arrived at the federal building at 4 in the morning and spent 2 hours giving a full statement, and Damien Cross's lawyers had filed for bail, but it wasn't going to be granted on the first application given the flight risk assessment. Claire spoke in the rapid, precise cadence of a woman who had worked through the night and was running on professionalism and caffeine, and the particular satisfaction of a complicated thing going right. At the end of the call, she said, "Selena, I need to ask you something directly." "Ask it." "The source breach, the timeline leak, that came from inside Moretti's organization. His lawyer, who has been removed." "I know, but..." A pause. "Are you still confident in that partnership?" Selena looked out the window at the city, at the morning sky that was gray and ordinary and nothing like the hostile clarity of yesterday. "Yes," she said. A beat. "Okay," Claire said. "That's all I needed." After she hung up, Selena sat with the question for a few minutes, not because she was uncertain about the answer, because she wanted to be honest with herself about why the answer was yes, wanted to make sure it was coming from the right place, from assessment and evidence, rather than from the thing that lived underneath all the assessment and evidence and complicated things, the things she'd been building careful architecture around for 14 months. It was both, she decided. Both things were true, and neither of them canceled the other out. She could live with that. 3 days later, Moretti's lawyer called. Her name was Helen Park, Korean-American, 50s, the voice of someone who had built a career on processing situations that required both precision and discretion. She asked a clear set of questions. She listened to Selena's answers without comment or reaction. At the end of the call, she said, "I'll have a preliminary assessment to you by Thursday. The statute of limitations creates a strong structural protection. The character evidence angle is the primary risk, and I've handled comparable situations. We'll manage it." "Thank you," Selena said. "That's what I'm for," Helen Park said, and hung up. 3 weeks after the arrest, Selena took a call from Sophie in Ghent. Diane Fossey and her daughter had been relocated. The new identity documentation was complete. Fossey was frightened but steady, and she had, in the controlled conditions of a secure video call 2 days prior, walked Selena through 12 years of documented irregularities in the Luxembourg entity with the calm, exhausted thoroughness of someone who had been living with the knowledge of what those documents meant and was finally, at significant personal cost, choosing to do something about it. The documentation was everything Selena had hoped and more. She sent the drive to Moretti with a single text message. "It holds." His reply came back in 4 minutes. "I know. Meet me Thursday. Petra's office." She typed back, "Okay." Then, after a pause, she typed one more word. "Lucien." 3 dots appeared. Paused. The dots resolved into yes. She smiled at her phone. Alone in her kitchen in the middle of the afternoon in the apartment she'd earned. Smiled at a one-word text message like a woman who had recently remembered that surviving things didn't mean you had to carry them forever. She set the phone down, picked it back up, typed, "The 10 days. You said it made you stupid. For what it's worth. I understood why. I just couldn't afford to say so at the time." The dots appeared almost immediately, held for longer this time. Then, "I know. For what it's worth, see, I'll be better about the information, all of it, even when it's bad." She looked at that for a moment. "Especially when it's bad," she typed back. "Especially," he sent. And then, Thursday. She set the phone down and stood up and went to the window and looked at the city. The ordinary weekday afternoon city, the one with no chandeliers and no federal agents and no dramatic geometry, just the dense, unremarkable machinery of 8 million people going about the specific difficulty of their lives. And she felt something she hadn't felt cleanly in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, something more durable than either. The feeling of standing in your own life without apology, without the weight of a story someone else wrote about you, without the specific hunching posture of a person waiting for the next thing to fall. She stood at the window for a while, just stood there, letting the city be ordinary, letting herself be in it without urgency, without the architecture of what came next, without anything except this moment and the quiet, surprising solidity of ground that had been earned. Though 6 months later, Damien Cross stood outside a federal courthouse in the gray November morning with reporters pressing in from every direction, and the particular exposed smallness of a man whose carefully constructed version of himself had just been publicly disassembled. He had cooperated. Not fully, not immediately, but enough. Enough to qualify for a reduced charge structure. Enough to give prosecutors the second and third layers of the Rael scheme, which had led to 2 further arrests and a federal investigation that was still ongoing and would likely be ongoing for years. His cooperation had landed him in a different category than the executives who'd gone down with him. It had not landed him in a comfortable category. He would serve time. The lawyers were still arguing the length. His assets were frozen pending civil judgments from the investors who'd lost money. Vanessa Hale had left 2 weeks after the arrest, which surprised nobody, including Damien. Selena had not watched the verdict. She'd been in a meeting, a real one, the functional kind, with 3 serious people talking about the infrastructure of the Rael case. When Claire had texted her the outcome, she'd read the text, acknowledged it, set her phone face down and continued the meeting. She saw him now by accident. She was in the back of a car crossing through the downtown area, heading from one meeting to another, and the car stopped at a light, and she looked out the window, and there he was. The cameras, the lawyers, the hunched posture of a man in the wrong weather without the right coat. He looked small, not in a satisfying way, in the way that people look small when the thing that was making them large turns out to have been borrowed. She looked at him for a few seconds through the tinted glass. Lucien was sitting beside her. He looked too briefly, and then looked at her with a question in his expression that he didn't need to say out loud. She looked at Damien for one more second. Then she turned away. Not because she'd forgiven him. She hadn't, and she wasn't sure she was required to. Forgiveness was its own economy, and she'd decided some time ago that she was going to stop spending it on people who'd never asked for it and would only have used it as further evidence that she could be taken advantage of. She turned away because she was done. Not done in the way of someone who has suppressed something. Done in the way of someone who has metabolized something fully and found that what remained was small enough to leave behind. The light changed, The car moved forward. "You okay?" Moretti said. She looked at him, at the familiar geography of his face, which she knew differently now than she had 6 months ago, which she was still learning in the ways that mattered. The face of someone who had chosen to stay at considerable personal cost and expected nothing in return except the same honesty he offered. "Yes," she said, and meant it. He nodded, looked forward again, forward. They rode in silence for a block, the easy kind, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that could only exist between people who had been through enough together that silence stopped being distance and started being a form of company. "Helen Park's assessment came through this morning," he said. "I know, she called me. And she said what she said she'd say. The structural protection holds. The character evidence angle can be managed." Selena looked out the window at the city moving past. "It's not gone. It'll always be there in the background, but it's not a bomb anymore." "No," he said, "it's not." She thought about that, about the Meridian account and what it had been. Not just a legal exposure, but the specific shape of her own worst judgment, 12 years old, made by a version of herself who was hungry and reckless and hadn't yet paid the full cost of those qualities. She'd carried it like a flaw that negated everything built on top of it, the way people carry their worst moments as though those moments were the most truthful thing about them. They weren't. She knew that now, not as a comforting idea, but as something she'd earned through the specific work of demonstrating it to herself, action by action, over 3 years and 14 months and 412 days of choosing the harder path, when the easier one would have been to disappear quietly and accept the story Damien Cross had written about her. She hadn't disappeared quietly. She had stayed and worked and built something true on top of something compromised, and discovered in the process that building true things on top of compromised foundations was not actually a metaphor for failure. It was, in fact, more or less the exact description of how most worthwhile things got made. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed. "We're close," she said. "Unravel. 3 more weeks and the documentation picture is complete enough to bring to the right people." "I know. It's going to be harder than Damien." "Yes," he said. "There's a real possibility that it comes back at us. At you specifically. His people are going to—" "Selena." His voice was quiet. "I know all of this." "I know you know. Then why are you telling me?" She looked at him. "Because you told me once that I was one of the least fragile people you'd met," she said. "And I'm telling you now that the same is true of you, and I need you to act like it in the next 3 weeks and not make any decisions that prioritize protecting me over protecting the case." She held his gaze. "We go at this equally, whatever the cost." He looked at her for a moment. In his eyes, that specific quality of steadiness, the thing that had confused her in the beginning because she'd misread it as coldness, and had since come to understand was actually something closer to the opposite, the stillness of a person who had made peace with what they were willing to stand in front of. "Equally," he said. "Yes." "Okay," he said. The car continued through the city. Around them, Manhattan did what it always did, moved and generated noise and proceeded without sentiment, and contained within its vast, indifferent machinery the 1,000 small stories of people surviving things and building things and losing things, and finding, sometimes, in the rubble of something they thought was finished, the beginning of something they hadn't planned. Selena Vaughn sat in the back of a car on a gray November morning with the worst of it behind her, and the next of it ahead, and felt, running underneath the tiredness and the complexity and the undeniable weight of everything that had been spent to get here, something she recognized now for what it actually was. Not invincibility. She'd given up on invincibility. Invincibility was the thing you reached for when you were afraid of being seen as breakable, and she had been broken and had survived the breaking and no longer needed to pretend otherwise. Not peace, exactly. Not yet. Maybe later. What she felt was this: the quiet, durable knowledge of a woman who had looked at everything that had been done to her, and everything she had done in return, and everything she had found in herself in the space between those two things, and had decided, with the full clear-eyed authority of someone who no longer needed permission from anyone to occupy her own life, that she was at last exactly who she intended to be. The car moved through the city. The gray morning held. Somewhere downtown, a man stood outside a courthouse in the rain. And inside a moving car, a woman looked forward through the windshield at the long road of everything that came next and felt, in her chest, something settling into place like the last stone of a foundation finally finding its ground. Not an ending. A beginning of the kind that only came after you'd survived being buried. She looked forward. The city opened ahead of her. She drove into it without looking back.